chapter 11. Ecclesiastes chapter 11. We are coming to the end of the book. We certainly see a little bit of the light at the end of the tunnel. And the next series of sermons, really 3 sermons in a row, will all deal centered around a very similar theme, that of stewardship and how we think about running our lives. I don't think my Prezi is connected, so let me try this real quick. I endeavor to talk slower as I'm preaching, but I know that still visible notes help you for sure, even while I'm trying to work on being a better preacher and speaking slower. And so the way Solomon or Kohelet, the teacher, the preacher, is going to walk into this last section is he's going to talk to us about just the investment of our lives kind of in a total way, in a holistic way. How do you and I pour our lives into our daily living? How do we function, and how do we work through what is obviously a very confusing and difficult world? And then next week, he's going to talk about investing our youth, our young age, our strength, our vigor, and how do we think about stewarding those aspects or that season of our life. The next one, starting in chapter 12, he's going to go after how do you invest or steward your old age. And he understands, and it seems to direct our hearts that Solomon is probably writing this toward the end of his life, and there's a lot of other clues for that, but he understands what it's like to age and what it's like to lose your strength and physical maladies. And I pray that will be an encouragement even to that generation in our church to recognize God knows and he understands. And then all of that is going to culminate in some of the final instruction from Solomon. But this morning, trying to understand how do we have a meaningful life? Well, this morning it's that we have a faithful life. And so Ecclesiastes chapter 11, and really the primary part of the section is verses 1 through 6. Verse 7 is a bridge, so I'm going to read all the way down through verse 7 this morning. So if you have your Bibles, Ecclesiastes chapter 11, picking up in verse 1. Cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Give a portion to 7 or even to 8, for you know not what disaster may happen on earth. If the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves on the earth. And if a tree falls to the south or to the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it will lie. He who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. As you do not know the way the Spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman with child, so you do not know the work of God who makes everything. In the morning, sow your seed, and at evening, withhold not your hand. For you do not know which will prosper, this or that, or whether both alike will be good. Light is sweet, and it is pleasant for the eyes to see the sun. You know, Galatians chapter 6, really verse 9 is central to this idea. It holds out to us that in this world, the way that God has structured this world is you reap what you sow, and we actually already live in that reality. If you throw some kernels of corn into the ground and you fertilize and you water and you weed, you don't expect barley to come up at harvest time. You're going to get more corn. If you sow watermelon, you get watermelon. If you have an apple tree, it produces apples, not pears. We understand this concept. You reap what you sow, and he applies that in Galatians in a spiritual way. If you sow to the Spirit, you reap of the Spirit. If you sow to the flesh, you reap death and destruction. And so the problem, though, is we also live in the world that doesn't always seem to work out for us. It seems like we can do lots of hard work on something and never see fruitfulness for it. We can pour our lives into something and never experience the benefit of it. We feel like we've done all the sowing, all the weeding, all the watering. Harvest time comes and we've got a bunch of tares instead of a bunch of wheat. It really becomes a Newtonian way of thinking. Every action results in an equal and opposite reaction, and we want life to work that way. We want it to be that if I practice more, then it will make me a better player, and that will result in more wins. If I study better or study more, I'll be a better student and get better grades. I'll get the scholarships I want, go to the schools I want. If I work harder, then it will result in more promotions and a raise. My bosses will see what I do, and they will reward me accordingly. If I discipline more, it will result in more obedience. If I disciple more, it will result in more growth. If I love more, it will result in greater affection in my relationships. More stuff will lead to more satisfaction. And this is the way we want life to work. And overall, God's saying that does tend to be the way it is. He structured the world in this way. But then you and I run into the buzzsaw of life. We run into moments where we've put in all the hard work. We don't seem to be getting the benefit. We sowed, but we don't get the harvest. We have been faithful, but there doesn't seem to be the fruitfulness to it. We're like Marcus Lattimore, arguably the best football player to have ever played at the University of South Carolina. He was the high school football player of the year, his junior and senior years here in South Carolina. He was recruited by everyone from Vandy to Tennessee to Clemson, and ultimately his mom didn't want him, but he ended up at the Gamecocks because Steve Spurrier danced the cha-cha slide with him, and she thought that was adorable. His freshman year, he scores 19 touchdowns, rushes for 1,600 yards, the SEC Player of the Year, Freshman of the Year. Junior year, everybody knows he's going to commit and go to the NFL, and he receives a brutal tackle from a Tennessee linebacker that destroys his right knee, shredding every ligament and knocking his kneecap out of place. He has surgeries, he recovers. The 49ers draft him anyway, and he has never, ever played an NFL game. All the talent, all the work, and he ran into a buzzsaw of a linebacker. Or when I worked at Shepherd's Home, a home that cared for the mentally disabled from a Christian perspective in Illinois, I think of David, who was a brilliant pastor. He pastored a church of over 400 people in the Chicago suburbs. He was effective as a preacher. He was noted as a counselor. He was an author of books. He had finished his Master of Divinity, was working on his doctoral dissertation, and one day he had a stroke in his office. When his secretary found him, he had been oxygen deprived. When he recovered several months later, he had the mental capacity of a 5-year-old. He could remember Greek words, but not their meanings. Theological terms, but not their depth. The faces and names of his 3 beautiful daughters, but not the relationship. His wife of decades, but not the oneness. Gone. All the talent, all the practice, everything gone. And so when you and I begin to go through life and we read books like Proverbs and we read Galatians 6, and we're hardwired to live in a world that what you sow you will reap, and God says he's not mocked and don't think any different. But it doesn't always seem to play out for us. 1 + 1 doesn't seem to equal 2. How do we persist in being faithful then to what God has called us to when we live in the reality there is no guarantee of success or faithfulness, fruitfulness? Is it really worth the investment? How do we sing songs like, "O come, all ye faithful," when we struggle to be faithful in the face of life's difficulties? And so in Ecclesiastes, and it's God's gift to us, the whole book has been wrestling with the complexities of life. The whole book has been wrestling with this reality that what I seem to experience doesn't seem to always match what I read. What do I do with it? And so the teacher wants to deal with our lives in a holistic way here at the end to challenge us to learn to live meaningful lives of faithfulness in the face of unpredictable fruitfulness. How do I disciple again today? How do I study again today? How do I open my Bible again? How do I pray again today? How do I share the gospel again today? How do I love this unlovely person? How do I give generously to this needy? How do I do this when there's absolutely no guarantee of fruitfulness, and I've spent lots of my life investing, Steve, and I haven't experienced it? Solomon understands that, and so he wants to speak into our lives. He wants to teach us that meaningful life is a faithful life, and he wants us to learn how to do it. Now, in searching for a way to teach us that, the teacher uses an illustration, and it's a profound one. It's from farming. Now, that's hard for us because most of us are not farmers. Certainly this west side of Baltimore city boy is no farmer, right? I know how to kill things, particularly green things. I don't know how to grow them, and yet the Bible's full of agriculture and agrarian illustrations, and so Solomon goes back to that, and actually I think it's fascinating why he does that. Because God has called all of us to be farmers and gardeners. From the very beginning in Genesis, he puts Adam and Eve in the garden and he tells them to work and to keep. In other words, they are going to tend, they are going to prune trees, and they're going to plant crops, and they're going to harvest, and they're going to make bread, and they're going to eat, work, and keep. And the introduction of sin doesn't change anything other than it's only going to be harder. Now you're going to do it with blood. Thorns and thistles are going to cut your hands, and it's going to be the sweat of your brow because the ground is going to resist you, and yet you're still called to garden. Our whole life's work is as gardeners. And so Solomon goes to a farmer. And the farmer he uses, though, is this illustration. We have this picture of this guy who's done it for a long time. He knows what it's like to go out in the spring season and feel the sun on his face, and to pick up the rich soil and to smell it and let it fall through his fingers, to know the seed is in the barn ready to be sown. This man understands by experience what it's like to sow and to reap crops. However, he's done it long enough to know things don't always work out. You can fertilize the soil perfectly, sow the seed perfectly, and yet the rains don't come, or blight happens, or drought occurs, or an infestation of locusts happens. A dust storm ruins the ground. Tares creep in, and so even when you think you have a lush harvest, you end up with a lot of nothing. And so he's an experienced farmer, but we might also say he's a cynical farmer. He's a farmer like us. Why should I keep pouring into this when I'm not seeing the results? And so the twisted Eden of Ecclesiastes reflects the true Eden of Genesis. Well, we understand, though, that our gardens are not just our work, but it is holistic. It does touch every area of life. And I think Richard Phillips does a great job of explaining that in his book, Masculine Mandate, and he applies it specifically to men, but we understand that this is not gender specific, right? That we're all called to work and keep. And so we're called to work and keep in the hearts of other people. We're called to work and keep in our workplaces and in our communities and our church family and our own personal families. We're all called to be gardeners. Now, just to prove that to you, this same exact illustration of sowing and looking for a harvest but not experiencing the fruitfulness you would anticipate. And so how do you be faithful? That same language of illustration is used at 4 places in the New Testament. It directs your heart and my heart to a way that even before we begin to dig into Ecclesiastes 11 and learn from it, I want you to be thinking about, where do you tend to struggle to be faithful in these garden areas of life? The first one is evangelism. You see it in Matthew 13. It's really a parable that flows in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's the parable of the 4 soils, and we're called to share the gospel. We're called to go forth and sow seed generously, to sow seed extravagantly, to let the seed fall, and yet by Jesus' own accounting measures in Matthew 13, 75% of the seed that is sown is going to come up bumpkus, right? Even if it sprouts up, thorns are going to choke it out. The sun is going to wash it out. Birds are going to come and pluck it up. Only 1/4 falls on good soil, and yet we are called to continue to sow. We sow fields, and then an enemy comes at night and sows tares among the wheat that crop up and seem to even corrupt the work that we've done, and yet we're told to continue to sow time after time after time. Jesus uses the same kind of illustration, calling you and I to faithfulness. One missionary in the western part of India in the 1850s, when missionaries are being slaughtered wholesale by the Indians at that time, they were asked, how do they keep going? And they said, because of Ecclesiastes 11. They are called to continue to sow and to do their work in the face of unpredictable fruitfulness, in the face of no harvest at all, and yet they continue. We need to learn how to faithfully sow the gospel. The cost is high. Rejection, humiliation. People reject the gospel, but it feels like they reject us. Close family, friends, neighbors, coworkers, we share the gospel with, and now they view us as that crazy Christian. And yet we need to learn, how do we sow faithfully? The reality is very few people in this room ever got saved the first time you heard the gospel. And yet you and I, we live in a world where we share the gospel once or twice, and we want to then say, well, they're rejecting, let me move on. We're like James and John, immediately want to call down fire and brimstone from heaven and knock the dirt off our sandals. And yet we're called to sow faithfully, even in the face of a lack of fruitfulness. We see it in the area of generosity or giving. The Corinthian church had been challenged to give, to take up offerings sacrificially so that they could give generously and faithfully to the needy saints in Jerusalem. They began well. They were taking up sacrificial offerings. Everybody's excited about this. They're excited about the opportunity to give physical means in order to care for spiritual bodies. And then they get fatigued. Over time, they get tired of it. They don't really know these people. And to be completely frank, there's some of these believing Jews in Jerusalem that wouldn't even like these Corinthian believers and would view them as second class. And I'm supposed to give my money to help this guy who thinks I'm second class. You've got to be kidding me. On top of that, I'm going to give the money to Paul. I don't really trust him because I think Paul's all in it for the money anyway. And so they stop. They get fatigued. They can't imagine the fruitfulness of it, and they grow weary in the giving of their things. It's easy to grow weary in joyful, generous giving. You could use that money for yourself. That's certainly what the Corinthians think. Look at all the needs that are my own home, my own family, my own church. Why should I give to this? The opportunity is there, but they're walking away from it. We need to learn how to invest our physical goods in a meaningful way. It's easy for our faithfulness to suffer because the cost doesn't seem to match the fruit that we're going to see. Thirdly, in discipleship, in Galatians 6, which I already referenced, where he talks about if you sow, you will reap if you do not faint. One of the most difficult things you can do is invest spiritually into another person. It will cost you emotionally. It will cost you physically. It will cost you spiritually. It will cost you mentally. When you're really giving yourself to the spiritual growth of someone else, they're with you in the middle of the night when you wake up. They're with you when you're trying to drive to work. They're with you when you're sitting at dinner and you have a far-off stare and your spouse says, "What are you thinking about?" And yet you don't see growth. Certainly not the growth you would want to see. It happens in the home as a mom and a dad tries to do family devotions, and every night their children fight them, or they try to discipline and disciple their children, and they just seem like they are having the same conversation 1,000 times a day. And we grow weary in it. We get tired of it. It's hard work to do restoration work. And the fruitfulness does not seem to match the investment. And so Paul uses this very similar farming illustration of sowing, reaping, even in the face of unfruitfulness. And then lastly, in suffering, the garden of suffering. James tells an amazing story, and Christians are being afflicted and they're suffering, and the temptations in James are very telling. You see, when believers are suffering, even from outside, two temptations occur. One is to hurt other people. I've been hurt, so I want you to know I've been hurt. I bet none of us have ever done that with somebody. We get in an argument with someone, get in a fight with somebody says something mean to us, you hurt me, now I'm going to hurt you back. That's one of the sure signs of a lack of faithfulness. The second one is they grumble against other believers. And so they're suffering and they're hurting, but it's everybody else's fault that I'm suffering and I'm hurting. It really doesn't matter if it's natural causes, doesn't matter if it's sinful results of their own life, it doesn't matter if it's affliction or persecution. We all have these tendencies. And yet he tells them to steward or invest, and he uses the same kind of language, to sow faithfully their suffering, even in the face of unrelenting unfruitfulness. A faithful sufferer points to Christ. A faithless sufferer points to themselves. We need to learn how to invest our suffering faithfully. And so I just want to ask you, before we get into Ecclesiastes 11, which of these would you say in your own heart you're struggling with right now? Maybe struggle is a harsher word than you would want to use. And so which of these maybe are you experiencing a lack of fruitfulness? Which of these do you have the greatest doubt to fruitfulness? Which of these do you not believe is going to be harvested ever? Which of these do you think doesn't match my investment? My return doesn't equal it. If this was a stock, I'd pull my money out of it. Or maybe you'd be gut level honest enough to say, I just don't do it. The fact of the matter is, if God has called me as a believer to do all these, I'm not faithful in it. I'm not faithful in sharing the gospel. I'm not faithful in discipling others. It is into that experience that Solomon writes Ecclesiastes 11. He gives us some basic truths as we try to learn that meaningful lives of faithfulness can occur in the face of unfruitfulness. And the truths are, I think, frankly, just obvious on the surface of the text as far as sowing and reaping. The greater depth happens as we apply these in our own lives in these different gardens that we're called to work in. So the first one, Ecclesiastes 11:1. Cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. The basic truth there is sow by faith, trusting for a harvest. That's really what he's saying. Now, the illustration, you've got to understand agrarian culture. Egypt is the breadbasket of the world at this time because of the Nile River Basin. They were genius with the way they'd figured it out, and they'd actually figured this out a couple thousand of years before Solomon's even writing. Because the Nile floods every single year, really in our calendar time, late springtime, headed into mid-fall. And so the floodwaters rise, and it's a result of all the snows that have fallen and coming down mountains some 4,000 feet. And it floods the whole Nile Plain area. And so what they had decided to do, what they'd found to do, just genius agrarian culture, is they created basins. And so large square plots, earthen dams that would square off sections of land. And so as the Nile would flood, it would rise up enough and it would fill that whole area. And then as the floodwaters would begin to recede, it would trap the water in those basin areas. And they would let that water just sit and soak for weeks till all the silt in the water had fallen down. And so then you have these basins still underwater. And they would slowly start letting the water out. But before the water had even fully gone, they would go out into this field and they would throw their seed, but it really would have looked like somebody's throwing a seed onto a lake or onto a pond. And the seed just goes away. And it seems crazy. Any farmer from anywhere else in the world would have thought this is absolutely nut job. What are these guys doing? You're wasting your seed. You're throwing it out here into a lake and it's going to get nothing. And yet they understood that it would fall down through the water. It would go into that loamy soil that was underneath the water. And as the water finally dissipated, suddenly, almost as soon as the water was gone, they would see all these massive green shoots coming up, and they would yield an incredible harvest, a harvest that did not just feed and flourish northern Africa as we would understand it, but it spread throughout the Middle East, and it was really the breadbasket of the ancient modern world. But it seems crazy. You and I investing in some of these areas seems crazy. Why in the world would you and I sow our seed into a place where it looks like there will never, ever be a harvest? The teacher knows this is profoundly difficult for us. Our seed is our life here. To throw it into the waters is crazy, particularly with the uncertainties of life. It's all too easy for the seed to be gone, but we're called to sow by faith. It's one of those moments where we begin to realize that it is experiential for them, it is knowledge-based for them, but it is still faith-based for them to throw their seed into these ponds of water. The teacher is telling us that we should think about the investment of our lives with the mindset that faith trusts in a future harvest. That's why our present sowing isn't a waste. But again, he understands that that's hard because life is unpredictable. And so he goes to verse 2. Give a portion to 7 or even to 8. For you know not what disaster may happen on the earth. Now, two things are indicated here with one dominant truth. So while you can, because the day may come when you can't, two dominant truths, though, that come out of this verse. First of all, you see a generous sowing. Now, see, coming out of verse 1, you're called to sow and throw your investment of your life, your time, your money, your mental and emotional and spiritual energy at something. But you don't foresee a harvest. So what is our tendency to do? Just give a little bit to it. Well, I'm not going to really throw myself into it. I'll just do a little. I'm going to dip my toe in the water. You're like the kid at the community pool when the week it first opens, right? He doesn't just jump into the deep end. He wants to dip his toe in before he knows what's going on. I took my family this past summer. We went to North Carolina. Beautiful trout stream right behind us. No, we didn't catch trout. I don't know how to fish. Anyway, there were trout there because we watched trout fishermen catch. But this is some cold mountain water. And my kids were all tubing. They're like, Dad, we want you to tube with us, tube with us, tube with us. The water's fine. They are liars. They were actually joking with that. But I jump in, and I mean, this is some frigid water. And so you don't want to jump in. I mean, in my mid-40s, look, I'm done with that. I don't need to prove my masculinity to you by getting into the ice. Polar bear plunge, no attraction. This is the way you and I are with the investments of life. If it doesn't seem like on the surface there's going to be a reward, we don't want to give ourselves generously to it. We want to hold back. And so the first thing he tells us, like, this is your job of your life. And so he uses these extravagant terms, give to 7 or even to 8, so really generously. But the other reason we want to hold back, and the other hidden truth here, is you and I know something bad is going to happen. And so we don't want to sow generously because there's no guarantee of success, and we don't want to sow generously because you and I are convinced we're going to need it for us. I got to hold back on how much I give into this because something will happen, right? I live long enough that when one shoe drops, just wait because the other one's coming. I've lived long enough, if I let you hit me on one side, you will hit me on the other. I've lived long enough that when I pour and pour and pour into, suddenly a disaster happens in my own life and I've got nothing, it seems like, to even do self-care. He knows our temptation then is to hold back, to not sow generously. Now, what's interesting here about this is he says, you know not what disaster may happen on the earth. This is not guaranteed disaster stewardship. What do I mean by that? Like, the fact of the matter is, if I am crazy busy this week, and I know next week there's surgery scheduled for a close family member that I need to be with, then right stewardship would say, I need to steward my time in such a way so I have adequate to give because I know this is happening. That's not what's going on here. This is not the guy who, because of his work, like a farmer, does tons and tons of work and sowing and reaping, and his harvest has to carry him all through the winter. And so he realizes, I have to steward or budget my harvest to last me through the winter. That's not what this is. This isn't the person who's planning because it's guaranteed something's going to happen. This is the person who's holding back just in case something happens. They've lived life long enough that they know blight can come. Drought can come. I only have so much emotional capital. I only have so much mental energy. I only have so much spiritual strength. And the call then to give it away generously to others seems like it's going to leave me lacking just when I need it the most. And so we avoid that hard conversation because it may cost me that relationship. We don't write that check. We don't make that call. We don't open the Word. We actually don't listen to the sermon. We tune out because we've got too many other cares in the world to worry over. We don't stand for what's right. We don't seek forgiveness or reconciliation because it all, frankly, just seems like a little too much that God expects for us. And we want to make sure we have it in the bank for when disaster may happen to me. It's a tough thing. This year might be busy, so I can't give myself to that. This year might be difficult, so I better not. And if we're really honest, the ultimate compounding of that over decades of our life is we sow sparingly. We invest minutely. Always waiting for the day. And it may never come. And so he goes to a third set of truths to unpack this a little bit more and to explain how this ties in to what he's been teaching all along. We see it in verses 3 and 4. If the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves on the earth. And if a tree falls to the south or to the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it will lie. Now, his point in verse 3 is this goes back to that Newtonian or sowing and reaping in Galatians. This is the way the world's supposed to work. You see a dark cloud, it's supposed to rain on you. And we even see that illustration in the Bible. False teachers are called clouds without rain. It looks like it's supposed to rain. They don't drop their rain on you. We all live down here in Columbia area. There's times I'll leave my house and it is bone dry. And by the time I get to work, it is a deluge with rivers running through the parking lot. And I call my wife, can you believe this rainstorm? She's like, what rainstorm? It's 8 minutes away, folks. We all know that a farmer could stand out there then, and these clouds are supposed to drop rain. He's expecting rain, and normally it rains, and the clouds go right past him, and they rain on his neighbor's fields. Doesn't it ever feel like that to you? Do you ever invest in something that feels like you don't get the return, but someone else reaps where you sowed? Does it ever feel like this is the way it's like the tree is going to fall, and this is the way it's going to fall, and you're looking at it sitting on a hill like this, and it's not supposed to fall uphill the other way? That's what he's saying in verse 3. You and I with life experience. Here's the point then. The longer you and I live life, the more prone we are to faithlessness. Because we've experienced fruitlessness. We've been burned. And so this is what he goes after in verse 4. He who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. He goes back to the fact of us trying to find meaning in life through wisdom or knowledge. Remember that the key in the first half of Ecclesiastes, chapters 1 through 6, was trying to find meaning in life through my work. Then you realize it doesn't work. And then the second half of Ecclesiastes, trying to find meaning in life through wisdom. And what he means is, if I knew more, I could understand more, and I could avoid all the painful things of my life. I could control it. It's really a seeking of control. And his point here is this: you and I cannot produce fruitfulness through our control and through what we know. Actually, what will happen is we become lazy. Now, that's a harsh word, but I want to remind you. He's using a farmer, so we go back to the farmer, and we can pick on the farmer first before we pick on our hearts, right? The farmer has one job, right? You've seen those memes like you have one job. The guy, all you had to do was paint stop, and he spells it spot, right? The guy, I saw one, because I used to do construction, house construction. It was like you got one job, and the bathroom door, when it opens, it hits the light that he hung, and it can't open the other way. Another one I saw, the faucet is running, and it's off center, and so it runs, falls off the side of the sink, and hits an electrical outlet. Like, you have one job, folks, right? We've all seen this. I don't do Jiffy Lube anymore. If you work at Jiffy Lube, I'm not trying to step on your toes, but like one of my first cars, I took it to Jiffy Lube, and the dude stripped the oil pan plug. I get home, I stop my car, and by the time I get home, I guess it wiggled loose enough because he had stripped it. It falls off, and I got like 3.5 quarts of oil laying out in the road. You have one job. The farmer's got one job: sow. That's his job. Go out and sow. Tend the fields, right? Till the ground up, sow the seed, watch the seed, weed the field, harvest the field. You got one job, and this guy won't do his job. It'd be like driving through Oklahoma or grain fields of Indiana, and you see all these farms, they've got all these seed planted, all the shoots coming, and then you get this one dude's, and there's nothing. He had one job, and he didn't do it. Why? Because he's experienced the pain of life, of what it's like to pour your very soul into something and get nothing. He knows what it's like to sacrificially, generously, faithfully give to something and receive ingratitude and see waste. He knows what it's like to build relationship with someone, to then sit down with them and ask them if they know where they'll spend eternity. After you've had them to your home for a barbecue and cookouts and parties, and you've done things with them, and you've invested relationally with them, and you've endured their lost way of living and their lost way of thinking, and you've gone outside of yourself and you share the gospel with them, and they never return your texts or calls again. This guy knows, because he's an experienced farmer, and he's had all the joy and all the excitement of going out and tilling the field and sowing faithfully and reading all the books and consulting the farmer's almanac, and he knows this is what it's supposed to do, and he does everything just the way you're supposed to. He gets to the end of the harvest, he goes to sleep, tomorrow I'm going to harvest it, wakes up the next morning, there's a rogue hailstorm, and it wipes everything out. He has experienced loss. He is the student who has poured himself or herself into studying and studying and studying. They do the very best they can. They take their time, and they get back a C. And it doesn't seem to reflect what they've done. The big point in verse 1 was keep sowing. That's your job. The big point in verse 2 was so generously, even though you know disaster might happen, but don't be controlled by the mights of life. Just because you know what might happen doesn't mean you know what will happen. Knowing it might happen can't even control it. And so suddenly you and I become a lot like the sluggard, the sloth in Proverbs. In Proverbs 20, verse 4, the sluggard does not plow in the autumn. He will seek at harvest and have nothing. Now here's an important distinction. The man who sleeps in because he's too lazy to work and get out and do what he's supposed to do, they'll find all kinds of excuses that are frankly eye roll emoji worthy. One of them in Proverbs is, I can't go out and work, there's a lion in the streets. No, there's not. And you're just like, really? You lazy bum. Right? This is the kind of guy, there's no job that's ever perfect enough. There's no job that's ever good enough for them. But this person in Ecclesiastes have invested, they've sown, they've watered, and they've experienced loss. They did it year after year after year. The next year it was taxes got raised. The next year it was an enemy sowing tares. The next year it was something else. And so as they walk out of their house on the very first day of sowing season, they look to the sky and it's cloudless. There's not a cloud there. And they know if they drop that seed in the soil, it's going to need rain. They was like, well, there's probably not enough and there won't be clouds and today's not the day to sow. And the next day they go out and there's too many clouds in the sky. And they say, well, now it could rain. Because I remember 6 years ago when I poured myself into that and then it rained and it washed the seed away. Today's not the day to sow. They come up with all kinds of reasons and excuses. They know better. Now, here's what's hard. To the lazy person or to the discouraged person, all their excuses seem very logical and reasonable to them. They might seem crazy to us. They might seem you would roll your eyes. And so it may be in one garden area of your life, you would roll your eyes at someone's excuses for why they don't work in another garden area. And you're like, all that is an excuse. Hard work hasn't brought meaning into our lives. And in fact, we've worked really, really hard and we've seen it blow away. Well, then wisdom will bring meaning because that will protect me from the pain of investing my energy, my time, my emotion, my spirit, my finances, and it'd be wasted. It really puts faithfulness on two sides of a balance, you might think of it. On one side, we want to control the fruit that will come up. And that can leave us stuck and lazy and doing nothing. We want to constantly envision, will this work out? Will this produce fruit? And if it won't, if I can't foresee that this is going to be worth the effort, then I'm not going to put the effort in. I want to control the harvest. And that's one side. On the other hand, we can become discouraged that we can't control the harvest. We get to the point where we realize before God, He's in control of the fruitfulness, and it doesn't seem like God always gives all this fruitfulness, and so why should I invest in it? And so whether we want to control it or we ultimately realize we can't control it, the product can easily be the same. Laziness. What really suffers is you and I are not faithful. And so then he comes to verse 5. As you do not know the way the Spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman with child, so you do not know the work of God who makes everything. So is all knowledge and wisdom a waste then? Is all this guy's experience of the 1 year rain washing out the seed and the other year there being drought, is all of it a waste? No. It just isn't doing in our hearts what it's intended to do. You see, we think it's intended to make me more productive and make me feel more successful. But that's not the intent at all. And this is his point of verse 5. The intent is actually to humble us. We are not in control. And so the teacher goes after something fascinating here, that there's so many tie-ins to this. This is one of those, if I ever have to preach a one-off sermon somewhere else, I'll probably preach Ecclesiastes 11:5. He's not talking about the science of conception. Human effort has happened. Conception has happened. But notice what he points out to. You don't know the way the Spirit comes to the bones in the womb of woman. He's talking about the divine moment God breathes life into conception. It's a mystery. Nobody knows how it works. Life from death, life from nothing is in God's hands. Life in the womb of a virgin is in God's hands. Harvest, fruitfulness, is not based on what we know. It's in God's hands. His point is, all your experience, instead of it making you faithless, should make you more faithful, because you're humbled and you realize, I can't predict. There will be times I will sow tiny seeds and envision nothing from it and yield a whole field of harvest of fruitfulness. There will be other times it will seem that I will sow extravagantly and there won't be fruitfulness in my lifetime. But as we learned a few weeks ago, even the normalcies of life can yield a harvest of righteousness in eternity. This should humble you and I, and should drive us then to work harder. And with every seed that we sow, pray, God, bring life into these dead bones. We have to learn to live meaningful lives of faithfulness in the face of unpredictable fruitfulness. Our failure to steward what He has given to us is sourced in a belief that all our hard work is going to be ruined anyway, because I can't control it. And so, what do? Well, just 3 quick ways, though, that you can see faithlessness. I got to come back, because how do I really know? Well, obviously, I think, first of all, you can tell you're faithless if you're not sowing in these areas. If you are not sowing generously, extravagantly, sacrificially, in things like giving, things like evangelism, things like your suffering, and things like discipleship, if you're not sowing, you are faithless. You've got one job. It's to sow your life in these ways. But another way you can tell that you're faithless is when you try to control everything with your emotions, right? James 1, man's anger doesn't work the righteousness of God. What's going on there? What's happening is I so am desperate for fruitfulness that I think my energy, my passion, my zeal, and so in James, my anger, or my mopiness, my manipulation, that's what's going to, my guilt trip, right? Guilt, the gift that keeps on giving, right? I can guilt you into doing what you're supposed to do. I can use passive-aggressive attempts to remind you to express gratitude for what I've invested. I can talk about how hard this is for me to drive you to obedience. Or I can control you by yelling and raising my voice, or violence even. I can manipulate you because I am so desperate for fruitfulness that my anger will do it. You're actually faithless when you do that. And then the third one would be, I'll get it out. When you judge your ministry or other ministries harshly, that's what the Corinthians do. They look at what Paul's doing and they say, we actually don't see fruitfulness for what you're doing. You must be doing it wrong. It's such a 1 + 1 = 2 that they assume if they cannot see the visible fruitfulness, then there is a lack of faithfulness. And Paul says that's not the case. God will judge me and He'll reveal it on the last day. When you and I judge ministry, ours or others, harshly, we are revealing that we really think in a faithless way. So we see the areas we're supposed to be faithful. We see the truths of Ecclesiastes and the uncertainties of life. And so then what's his answer? Does Solomon give us anything here to help us? And he does. He gives us the farmer and the son. In the morning, the old grizzled farmer walks outside. And it's springtime. And he's got the bag of seed strapped around him. And he's standing there in front of this basin of water. And he's thinking about how a couple years ago he sowed so early. He thinks that's why the harvest didn't come up, because the water actually washed over the berms and ruined the seed. And he's wrestling and he's tired and he's done it for so many years and his knee hurts. And he looks over here and he sees a young buck who just got his property, been out there for 2 hours already sowing, throwing his seed everywhere, and he's looking at him. He's like, he's even wasting seed. He doesn't even know what he's doing with his seed. He looks up at the sky, and there's not a cloud in the sky, and he remembers the year when he sowed, and there was no water that day, and it ruined everything. And his heart just wants to go inside. His heart wants to say, I can't give anymore. I can't have that one more discipleship conversation. I hurt, and I'm tired, and somebody else can do it. I can't share you know what? Somebody else can share the gospel. I can't write that check and help meet that need over there that I see. I can't. It's not in me. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't even remember how much seed I have in the barn. I haven't even checked all the bags, and maybe some critters have gotten in there and they've eaten some of my grain, and I don't even have 7 or 8 to give out. And he's in this moment of a test of whether he would be faithful, and Solomon says, in the morning sow your seed, and at evening withhold not your hand, for you do not know which will prosper, this or that, or whether both alike will be good. Light is sweet and is pleasant for the eyes to see the sun. One morning at Shepherd's Home, a Sunday morning, I took David. He was in my care that morning, and I had to walk him to where the van was going to take several of the residents out to a local church where they would sing a song and they would present the ministry of Shepherd's Home to try to get people to give, because it was a ministry, and they took really children and siblings and even spouses that were mentally damaged from families who couldn't care for them, and so they needed to raise support from local churches. And so I wanted to walk David over to the van. I helped him get dressed that morning. I helped him tie his tie and shine his shoes, because it was a special morning for David. David loved these mornings. And so as I walked him out, we were the first ones waiting there by the van, and he just was staring into the sky. And I'm like, David, how you doing? What's going on? And he said, today is a great day. I said, well, why? He said, the sun is shining, and I get to preach today. Because even in his childlike state, his mentally damaged state, he could remember sermons that he had preached years before. He did not fully comprehend the depth or the content, but he was saying, I get to do today what God has called me to do. And he was delighting in the opportunity to be faithful. As the farmer goes out to work, he knows at the end of the day, his back is going to be sore, his shoulders are going to be screaming from sowing. But his tan will be a little deeper. The work will be done because he will have been faithful. And so what Solomon is saying is, feel the sun on your face as you work in the field, embracing the opportunity to work, because this season will pass. The days of you being able to faithfully invest in whatever capacity God has given you now will not last. You are only at this point in your life one time. This is it. And what he's telling us is the faithful farmer is the one who goes out and he's willing to just delight in the richness of the soil, the sound of the birds, and the sun shining on his face, because he knows the day will come when it's not just a sore knee or a ruined shoulder, it's not just age or time, but the day will come when he no longer can. And so Ecclesiastes, which is all about living life in this twisted Eden and life under the sun, he's telling us you and I can be faithful as we delight in doing what God has called you to do today. In other words, we take our delight off of a guarantee of future harvest. We walk by faith, trusting God for it, but we shift our delight ever so slightly to being empowered by God to do today. And so we feel the sun's smile on our faithful work, trusting Him to faithfully reward with a rich harvest in His time. when we trust God for the fruitfulness of our lives, then we're ready to embrace the beauty of the moment. Then we're ready to faithfully sow, generously sow, consistently sow. Then we're ready to share the gospel faithfully, to be able to give faithfully, to be able to suffer faithfully, to be able to disciple faithfully, because we realize those are all gifts of God. You know what's interesting is sometimes your eyes can be open to that by standing next to the Davids of life with people who seem to have lost the opportunity you have. And to realize the preciousness of the gift of God to be able to faithfully sow. This is why Jesus depicts the faithful steward as the one who works so hard at sowing his seed and then is able to sleep at night. Our faithfulness is wrapped up in God's faithfulness. We can work hard because Jesus has brought us into his kingdom. If you know him this morning, get this, your faithfulness is a reflection of his faithfulness. And so your fruitfulness is wrapped up in his fruitfulness. God will bring a harvest. God is faithful. At Christmas time, we celebrate his faithfulness. We celebrate the fact that for thousands of years, the prophets proclaimed he is coming. And so many of them died and were martyred, and they never saw it happen. But then, as the Bible says, in due season, he came. And I want to remind you, in due season, he will return. He was faithful to send his son as a baby, that we celebrate this time of year. We celebrate his faithfulness to rescue us, to show us mercy, to give us compassion, and to one day reveal a harvest of fruitfulness, because he has promised to do just that. Each act of your faithfulness is a declaration that God is faithful, and we're able to serve him with joy because he is better than visible fruit. Is your life meaningful because it's faithful? Do you know what I look forward to one day? And I don't know how we'll all process it, so I'll just put it in agrarian terms. I look forward to the day in glory when me and whatever few wagons of harvest show up before the throne, to declare back to him the fruit of his work in me and through me. And do you know what I look forward to with you, church? Is celebrating and cheering as each one of you bring your harvest in. And I want your harvest to be extravagant, not 30-fold, not 60-fold, but 90-fold. And so I want to encourage you, wherever you are discouraged or wherever you are struggling to be faithful, I want to urge you to let the sun shine on your face. Life is short. Embrace it and be faithful that your life might be meaningful. Father, we thank you for being a faithful shepherd. We thank you for calling us to be faithful stewards. We thank you that that's what you say in Corinthians, that judgment will be, it is required of a steward to be faithful. Father, would you lift up weary hands? Would you straighten paths? Would you set crooked knees? Father, would you do this that we might be encouraged in you and run this race with endurance? May we sow generously. May we sow faithfully, delighting in the opportunity to sow, trusting you by faith for a harvest that will one day come. Father, we know it will come. We know it must come because you are a God who brings in the rich harvest. You have promised it to be. And Father, when we walk in the Spirit, our sowing, our faithfulness is tied up in yours. And you are no God who breaks your promises. And so, Father, encourage our hearts this morning that we have been rescued by one who empowers us and calls us to good work. May we do it with zeal for your glory. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.